Proxmox is a very popular hypervisor which is based on the Debian Linux distro. It's free to use and most of the management can be done via a web browser. But one of the features that stands out to me is that it's got built-in firewalling. But how do you install Proxmox? Well, if that's something you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. Now, as with any other operating system, if you want to install Proxmox onto a computer, you need to be able to create a USB boot disk first. Now, what I would suggest is actually using Balena Etcher here, for example. If you don't already have that installed, then point your web browser to this URL here, which I'll include in the description, and then click on the download button. And we'll be using that to actually create our USB boot drive from the ISO image that we'll download from Proxmox. If you're using Linux, on the other hand, then you've probably got an actual USB flash application already built in anyway, but this is definitely useful, I find, for Windows, and as I say, I've already tested it with Proxmox anyway, so it does work. Now, to download Proxmox itself, we need to go to the download page. So point your web browser to this URL here, which I'll include in the description, and what we're interested in is the Proxmox virtual environment. Lower down here you can see there's two options. We can either click the link here or just click the download button. If you click the download button, it'll just download the actual ISO file itself, but if we click the link here, what this does is, as well as giving us the actual download button to download the image, it also gives us the actual checksum that goes with that image. And this is a way to actually check the integrity of the file to see if it's been damaged or tampered with during transit, for instance. So what I would suggest is download the actual file by clicking on the button there, but keep this tab open so we can come back and check the actual integrity afterwards. Now, the next thing to do is to check the file integrity once we've downloaded this ISO image. And if you're on a Windows computer, we can actually use PowerShell to do that. So I've got an actual command here, which we can run in PowerShell, which is get file hash. And basically what we're going to do is use that command and supply it with the name of the actual ISO file that we've downloaded. So this will change every time you download a different image. But what we want it to do is tell us what the actual hash is. And then based on the output, we're then going to run a comparison to see if it actually matches what we've got between the quotes here. So the command's going to generate the hash from that actual image file. And then it's going to compare it against this actual hash that we've got here, provided by the website. So I'm just going to take a copy of that. And then I'm going to open up PowerShell. So I'll just type in power and I'll select PowerShell here. Now I need to switch to the actual folder where I've downloaded the image to. And then I'm going to paste in my command. And then once I hit return, as I say, it's going to generate that hash from the image, because by default, the command's using SHA-256, which, if you come back to here, the actual website tells us that the actual, the checksum that we've got here was generated using SHA-256. But if we look at the output from the command, it says the result is true. In other words, the output from this image file, the hash that's been produced, does match what's been supplied between the quotes. In other words, the actual checksum that we've got from the image file that we've downloaded does match what the website says it should be, in which case the image is actually intact. So now we can actually create our USB boot disk. Now, if you're using Linux instead of Windows, there's a slightly different way you can actually do file integrity checks. Now, I'm going to open up the text editor, because what you do depends on the actual algorithm that was used to create this hash that we've got on the website. So as you can see, this one was created using SHA-256. So in the case of this Linux computer, we need to use the SHA-256 sum command. We then need to feed it the actual file that we want to generate a hash from. And then what we're going to do is, rather than just get the entire output, is we're actually going to pass the output over to grep, and then we'll do a filter on the actual results. And then what we've got here is to say, have a look in the output and see if you can find this. In other words, this is the actual checksum that the website's telling us we should be getting from a hash that's generated from that file. So I'm just going to copy that, and then I'm going to open up a terminal session. I'm going to switch over to my downloads folder, and I'm going to paste the actual command in, hit return. And what we should get is, if we get a match, we should get that long checksum value back in red text. Now this is a virtual machine, so it might take a while. Oh, okay, just as I spoke. So as you can see, it's actually come back with that actual checksum in red text. In other words, we do have a match. The hash that was produced from this specific file here does match what is on the actual website. In other words, the file is intact, and we can now actually use that to create an actual USB boot disk. Now, in order to install Proxmox onto a computer, we need to create a USB boot disk. Now, it doesn't really matter whether you're going to be using a Windows computer or a Linux computer to do this. The end result is the same. You'll be able to have a USB boot disk that you can plug into a computer, turn that computer on, and it'll boot up and start the installation process. So as Windows is a more popular operating system out there, I'm going to be using Balena Etcher on this Windows computer that I've got. It's a pretty straightforward process. We need to point it at the file that we want to actually use, specifically the ISO image that we've downloaded. We then want to point it at the actual USB drive that we're going to be installing this and creating our USB boot disk from. And then once that's all decided, we'll then just click on the flash button there. So first things first, we need to point it to the actual ISO image. So I'm just going to click on this flash from file option. I can just double click the actual file or select the file and then click open. By default, it's already picked a USB drive that it's detected on the computer. If I don't want to use that and I want to use a different one, I can click on the change button here and then select that USB drive. I would suggest though, don't actually have multiple USB drives in there if you can help it. It makes it less likely that you'll accidentally overwrite another USB drive by mistake, and that's what this is going to do. It's just going to wipe out whatever's on that USB drive and create a completely new boot disk from it. So just something to bear in mind. Now in my case, it's the only one I've got anyway, so I'm just going to leave that as is, and then I just need to click on the flash option here, and then off it'll go. Because it's going to be running through the command processor here, I have to confirm that because of user access control, so I'll click yes. And then off it goes, and it'll actually create that USB boot disk for us. Now, this is going to take a bit of a while. It's suggesting it's going to take several minutes, but once it's finished, I'll bring you back. Now, Etcher's just actually finishing validating the actual boot drive that it's created, so it's just finishing off. And so that it's saying, yep, we've now actually finished it. Do you want to create another one? Now, what will sometimes happen is that Windows will then actually pop up a warning message and says that it doesn't actually recognize the USB drive that you've got installed. Yep, that's what I've got down here. So if I just click on that, it's offering the option to actually format that disk. And I don't want to do that because I've just literally created it using Etcher here. The disk that's now connected into the computer is actually a USB boot drive that I actually want to use. So I'm going to click on cancel. Now, sometimes it might do that on several times. It might keep popping up that dialog box, but basically you don't want to reformat that disk. It's now set up ready to be used with your computer. Now, because the process is pretty much the same for a Linux computer, I'm not going to repeat that process. It's just the same as on this Windows computer. You just point the application at the ISO image, point it to your USB drive, and then just tell it to flash a USB boot disk from that actual image. Now, before you actually start the installation process, the first thing we need to do is to make sure that the computer supports virtualization, and that's a setting within the BIOS. Now, unfortunately, it's going to vary depending on the manufacturer of the motherboard, whether you're using an Intel processor or whether you're using an AMD processor, so I can't really go over that in much detail. But I'll leave some guidelines within the description as to the sorts of things you need to actually look out for within the BIOS. But typically, once the computer actually boots up for the first time, you would hit the delete key, F2, F1, or whatever. It'll actually prompt you to tell you what key to press to enter the BIOS. And then within there, you're looking for various settings to change. Now, one thing I will point out though is that if you're using an Intel NUC, do make sure that the operating system is set to Linux. Usually I tend to find it's set to actually use Windows. Now, if it's left at that setting, what tends to happen is the installation process will boot up and then it'll just fall over and complain that the process is not right or something, in which case you need to make sure that within the BIOS of that Intel NUC, it's actually set to support Linux as the operating system. After that, it's fine. Now, in my case, I'm actually installing this onto another hypervisor. So I'm actually doing nested virtualization, but the process is going to be the same. I've created a virtual machine and I've had to edit this to support hardware virtualization. So I'm just going to click on the edit button here just to show you. Just expand the CPU options. You can see, and I've ticked the box to say to support hardware virtualization. So on your physical computer, you'll have to do something equivalent within the actual BIOS. Now, in my case, I'm actually booting directly off the actual ISO image, but the principle is the same, really. It doesn't really make any difference. It's a lot easier to actually point to an ISO file on an actual hypervisor like this than it is to plug a USB drive in. So the idea is I'll power this computer up just like any other computer, except in my case, it'll point to the ISO file rather than the USB boot drive, but the principle is exactly the same. Now, once you've made sure that your computer will support hardware virtualization, the next thing to do is to actually install the operating system. And I must admit, there's not a great deal that's needed. It's a very lean operating system, just like any other hypervisor is. Just a few questions to answer, and then that's it. It'll do the installation. Now, in my case, I am installing it into a virtual machine, but it really doesn't make any difference. It's just going to go through the exact same process. The one thing I'll point out is that I've since added in a second hard drive, and that's so I can demonstrate being able to set up redundant hard drives within the actual hypervisor. Now, within a virtual machine, this doesn't make any sense. All of the redundancy takes place within the actual physical computer itself, but I do want to be able to demonstrate how to actually set up a software RAID array. So, first thing to do is power the computer on. And it is pretty quick, I must admit. It just suddenly pops up the console here. It doesn't throw up a delay. I'm just going to make sure that this is visible first in the video before I go any further. Right, and then it's going with a default option, which is to install the actual Proxmox hypervisor, which is what we want anyway. So, like I say, unlike other operating systems, it doesn't throw in a delay and then count down, giving you only a brief amount of time to actually make a different choice. It just halts. So in our case, all we want to do is install the actual hypervisor itself. So I'm just going to hit return. And then off it goes. It starts the installation process. Now what it will do is go off to an actual DHCP server to get an IP address. And then once it does that, it'll then carry on. And then it's actually going to halt the installation. In a moment, what's going to happen is it's going to pop up an end user licensing agreement. As with other software that you install on computers these days, there's always going to be terms and conditions you either have to agree with if you want to actually use the software. If you don't, well, you can't use it. So what I would suggest is have a read through these terms and conditions that you've got here. If you don't like them, go with the board. If you're okay with them, click on I agree. Assuming you've actually decided to agree with the installation and you've agreed to those terms and conditions, the next thing is to actually tell Proxmox where we actually want to install the software to. Now, if you've only got one hard drive, then typically what it'll do is it'll pick that hard drive out, and all you've got to do is click next. Otherwise, what you could do is click on the drop-down menu and tell it to go with a different hard drive, for example. Now, in our case, we actually want to set up a software RAID array. Again, although this is a virtual machine and it doesn't make sense, I just want to be able to demonstrate how you actually would do that on a physical computer. And to do that, we need to click on the options box here. Then from the drop-down menu here, where it's got file system, by default it's set to ext4. What we want to do is change it over to ZFS RAID 1. Now, RAID 1 is basically mirroring two hard drives together. The idea is if a hard drive breaks, Proxmox will be able to still carry on. It just means now it's running on one drive. Later down the line, what you would do is replace that broken drive and then rebuild the array. But the good news is it'll still carry on working. If all we did is install this onto one physical hard drive and the hard drive broke, well, that's it. The computer would just stop working. So this is extremely useful, especially for a hypervisor, because you've got so many other computers running as virtual machines. There's such a big dependency on it that it makes a lot of sense to set up redundancy like this. RAID 0 doesn't make any sense because it stripes two hard drives together to create more storage capacity. And what happens then is if one hard drive breaks, that's it. The whole RAID fails. The other options that we've got for ZFS don't really make sense for an operating system. These are more for where you're going to be installing virtual machines to, for example. That's to give you better write performance, better read performance, and so on by having, combining multiple hard drives together. It's not really worthwhile for an actual operating system. All we're interested in is just keeping the actual system running, protecting us against a hardware failure, specifically the hard drive breaking. So we just want to mirror the actual drives together, because once the actual operating system's up and running, that's pretty much all we need. We're not too concerned with the performance after that. There is other options. You could do Btrfs if you wanted to instead, but we're just going to go with ZFS. Now, one thing to point out as it warns you here is it says this is not compatible with RAID array controllers. Now, if you actually had a RAID array controller, you wouldn't be doing this in the first place. What you would do is you would actually combine your two hard drives together within the RAID array software. That would then present a single drive to Proxmox as an example, but it would actually be two drives mirrored together, overlaid using the actual hardware RAID array controller to make it look as though there's actually only one drive. And it doesn't make sense to have a software RAID on top of a hardware RAID, for example. So that's why it's warning you about this sort of thing. Another thing to point out is that it's picking out two hard drives. Now, if you've got multiple hard drives and it hasn't picked the correct ones, you would want to change those. Now, I've only got two, so I don't have any other option really, so I've got to go with those. But the key thing here is that you've got to do this at the time of the installation. You won't be able to install a mirrored array if you've only got one drive, for example, then add the second redundancy drive afterwards. It doesn't work. It won't let you do that. If all you've got is one drive to pick from and you pick OK, it won't go any further. It won't let you do that. You've got to do this at time of installation. So if you want to set up redundancy like this, do make sure that those, you've got these two drives already available and presented to the computer before you actually start the installation process. Anyway, as part of the demo, I've got two drives. We're setting them up as a ZFS RAID 1 array, so I'm going to click on OK now. And now we click on Next. It's now wanting to know details about your location and time zone. So as soon as you start typing in your country, it starts to filter the choices out. So in my case, I'm going to go with United Kingdom. By default, it'll usually pick out the proper time zone and keyboard layout, but you can change those if you want. Then you need to click Next. Now you need to put in a password. Now, this is a lab, it's a video. If I put in something too long, too strong, it's going to mess the video up probably, because I'll probably make mistakes trying to type the thing back in again. But as it warns you, do use a strong password. Ideally use a password database manager, something that comes up with a really long password made up of numbers, letters, special characters or symbols as it refers to here, to make this strong, because this is going to be your root password. So this is the supervisor account that can do everything. So I'm just going to put a password in here, and then I'm going to confirm that. Now you do have to put in a legitimate email address in here. What you put in here is actually going to be what Proxmox will be using to send notifications to. So it's got an example in here, but if you click on Next, it will complain that it's not valid. It won't allow you to do it. So I'm just going to put in one like that, for example, for the domain that I've got. It doesn't have to be a legitimate, accurate domain, if you will. It just needs to be something that complies with an email address, for example, because you can change this afterwards if you don't have an email account, for example, to send to. Because to be fair, you're going to have to actually set this up to be able to talk to an email server later down the line anyway. So once you've set up your password, set up an email address, click Next. And sure enough, even though I've got a simple password, it's still not actually working. So I'll try that again. There we go. Now, next thing it asks for is the management network configuration details. So there is only one interface on this computer. It's only got one network interface card, but you can change that if you want. It already set up the host name. I'm going to change that from PVE to PVE Node 2. It's pulled the actual domain name from my DHCP server, but you can change that to something else if you like. The IP address, I'm going to change that because what it's done is it's getting an IP address from my DHCP server, but I want it to use this static IP address here. I can change the mask length, if you will, or the subnet mask, however you want to refer to it. And then what we've got here is the gateway, the default gateway that it will use, along with the DNS server, and it got this from the DHCP server. Again, you can change these to something else if you want, otherwise you can leave them as is. Then we'll click on Next. And then it comes up with a summary telling you what it's going to configure. If you want to change these, you can always click on the previous button and go and edit things. Otherwise, just click on Install. And as it says, once it's finished the installation process, it'll then reboot. So I'm okay with these settings. I'm going to click Install, and then off it'll go. Now, this will take a while for me because it's a virtual machine running within a hypervisor, so it's going to take a bit longer than it would on, say, a physical computer. So once it gets to the next stage, I'll bring you back. Now, as you can see here, the actual installation has actually finished. It got to the end, and then it did an automatic reboot, and then it's started up and it's installed Proxmox on this computer. Now, in the case of VMware, it automatically detaches an ISO image from a virtual machine. When it comes to your physical computer, you'll want to actually disconnect the USB boot disk before you let that computer reboot. Otherwise, there's always the potential that it might actually then go through the installation process all over again. Anyway, now that the actual installation's finished, what we want to do is point our web browser to actually manage this server to the URL that we've been given here. So if we go over to this computer that I've got here, I've connected into that URL. Now the problem is it's saying that the connection's not private, and that's because the computer's configured with a self-signed certificate. The web browser here has no way of validating that this server is what it says it is. It doesn't know where that certificate came from. It's got nothing to cross-reference, and that's why it's saying it's not secure, why the connection is not private. I mean, we are still using HTTPS, which means that the actual connection between our browser and the server is encrypted, but we don't genuinely know if we are connecting to the legitimate server. So that's just something to bear in mind. And now these are things we can fix later down the line, but for this video, really I just want to get the actual installation process itself done. In which case, click on Advanced, and then in the case of Brave, just click on the link to just carry on. And then what it does is it throws up the login prompt. So I'm going to type in the username, which is root. Then I'm going to try and type in the password. And click on login and see if it's right. Yeah, it is. Now, because we haven't taken out a subscription with Proxmox, which you do have to pay for, you will always get this message popping up saying there is no valid subscription. In which case, click OK. Now, to me, that's pretty trivial given what you're actually getting access to here for free. What the subscription's for is to get you technical support and access to the enterprise updates, for example. Without that, that's something you don't get. You're on your own, you don't get the enterprise updates, but you're getting access to everything else. So at the moment, for example, I've just got one node. I can add multiple nodes into a cluster so that I can then do migrations of virtual machines from one node to another. So that's live migrations. I can do a high availability and so on. I can add in access to NFS storage for shared storage, iSCSI. I can add extra local storage, create virtual machines, take snapshots, revert them, all sorts of things I can do. It's all I'm missing out on is access to the enterprise updates and technical support. I can get access to non-subscription updates, and I do get access to other software updates at Proxmox. So that's just something to bear in mind. If you're going to be doing this for a business, then you probably would want to take out an actual subscription for it. But if you're just using this personally in a lab and so on, yeah, just that annoying dialog box that you get to confirm that you know you haven't got a valid subscription is pretty trivial, really. But otherwise, I must admit, I really do like this hypervisor. Just so many options it gives you, so many things to take advantage of. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, because that encourages YouTube's algorithm to suggest it to other people who might find it useful as well. If you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yeah, do subscribe. Just remember to click the little bell icon though, that way you'll get notifications when I send new content out. If you've got any comments, any suggestions, if you want to leave any feedback at all, please post that in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support the channel, I've left links to both Patreon and PayPal in the description below. But above all, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.